things a little different than what we would see in the real arbitration. On the day of the project, once we choose the mock arbitrators, we test their equipment and internet speed. If they need, we can, and we did this earlier in the pandemic, we would actually send the arbitrators a computer completely loaded up. All they had to do was turn it on, and we had somebody running the computer remotely for them. Now, as things have gotten, people have gotten more experience, people have upped their internet access, they've upped their computer equipment, and they've got more comfortable using these online platforms. So we don't have to do that as often, but if we need to, we can do that and make sure the arbitrator can do everything that's needed. We give them background material, and we usually send it out a week before. And something we learned doing arbitrations, mock arbitrations years ago, is you got to set a limit on how much the arbitrators are going to spend reading the material. Because if you don't, you might have one arbitrator that's a little more prepared than the others. And also cost is a factor. It's not cheap getting these highly experienced, usually former judges. And so we have to limit and control the time that they spend. And so this keeps the budget from getting out of control. So usually we give them about 10 to 20 hours, give or take, to read the materials before the project. On the day of the project, the arbitrators and the research team will check in about 30 minutes before, and I'll talk about that process. They check into a virtual check-in room, and normally the trial techs have set up their virtual presentation room either at their home in their office, and that's what Joe will talk about, just setting up that virtual space where you're going to be performing in front of the camera for your part of the presentation. And doing this, again, early provides you the opportunity to practice before your actual online arbitration. So this is what it looks like on the day of the project. Everybody logs into a virtual check-in room. And then once we check in and make sure everybody's who they are, we send the arbitrators to a virtual waiting room. And we have them answer last-minute questions. We go over the protocols with them again and just make sure everybody's teed up to go. After we do that, we send them to the virtual research room. And this is a really important security check because there's no way for somebody to enter that virtual research room without going through this two-step process. And that ensures, excuse me, struggling for a word there, ensures that we have security. And our 7 years now of doing online research, we've never had a project breached. Now, later on in the day, we have the ability to break into breakout rooms, and maybe we'll get the arbitrator, one of the attorneys, and a DQ researcher together to talk about what they're thinking about the case, answer questions, that kind of thing. We talk with the attorneys before the project to figure out what type of feedback they want from the arbitrators. You know, we find out, do they want the arbitrators, can the arbitrators interrupt the presentation as they're giving information? Do we have the arbitrators hold their questions at the end of the presentation? There are pros and cons for doing it each way. And again, we work with the attorney because every research is different and we tailor the research for the needs of the client. The project schedule, projects can last from 1 day to a week. We've also done them in the past when we've had just really busy folks, both in terms of the arbitrators and the attorneys, where we might do 1 day of the project 1 day, another day a week later. We can do it however you need, but usually they last between 1 day and a week. We have between 3 and 9 mock arbitrators. So usually if you're going to have one arbitrator for your actual arbitration, we'll have a panel of 3 arbitrators. If you're going to have a panel of 3 arbitrators, we'll try to have 2 panels of 3 arbitrators. And the reason we want more people is if you happen to have an outlier amongst the group of arbitrators, then you don't really get some skewed data because you can balance it out with the data from the other arbitrators. Occasionally, arbitrators will give feedback about witnesses, and obviously this can be really important. And what we often do is we'll prepare witnesses either before and or after the arbitration based on the feedback we get from the arbitrators. The report describes the thought processes of each of the arbitrators, which sides they favor, the information that they base their decision on, the arbitrator's suggestions on how to improve the presentations. And this is really important. The information the arbitrators wanted to know wasn't given in the presentations. And again, as I said before, having a hole in the story is really bad, both for jurors and in an arbitration, because that is an incomplete story and people don't like incomplete stories. And so the more complete your story can be, the better it is for you, because you also run the risk of having information filled in, because people don't like a vacuum. And so they'll fill in that information. And oftentimes that information, what they fill it in with, cannot be helpful to your case. We also do graphic recommendations, and I'll let Diana talk about that during her talk. And so in summary, here are things, just takeaways for this. Do the arbitration research online if you have an online arbitration. Again, it lets you practice on the same type of playing field that you're going to be playing on. Start thinking about what your virtual courtroom is early, because there's a lot to think about in that. And you'll really see that in Joe's presentation. Make sure that whoever you use, whether it's us or somebody else, that you get quality mock arbitrators. Because if you get a group of people who really just don't match up to what your arbitrators are, you're not going to get the best data to help you put on the best case. Ensure the property security measures are in hand. Again, you don't want somebody hacking into your arbitration research. Make sure you use the same rules and procedures as in the real arbitration. And then also make sure that the arbitrators, as I said before, don't know who's putting on the research project, because you're not going to get as good, tough love from them as you would if they don't know that. So that's my presentation. Again, at the end, you're going to get my contact information. I know I went really quick, but I want to leave plenty of time for my colleagues to give you the great information they have. So reach out to me, send me an email, answer any questions that you have. With that, Diana, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stu. Okay, one moment here. So what I'd like to do today, once I get this in presentation mode, can you see my screen?
It's not in presentation mode.
That's what I'm struggling with. Hold on one second. One moment, I'm going to start over. Okay, so I'm going to ask our technical director, Joe Simons, how do I remove the toolbar at the bottom of the screen so I can go into presentation mode?
You should be able to click on it and have it go away. There's minimize, or you can hit the Alt button, and the Alt button should also show and hide the controls.
Okay, so can everyone see my screen now?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so this is the first time that has ever happened. Thank you, everyone. To start, I'd like to briefly talk about testing demonstratives during a research exercise. And this can be a very important part of preparing for your arbitration. Now, since mock exercises are often a battle of the stories, a few well-planned graphics can help you tell your story quickly and also frame the dispute, the parties, and the critical information. And we know from our research that decision makers find graphics helpful to understand and remember the evidence. mostly because your graphics, you would hope, would bring the case to life. And we'll look at some examples shortly. Another advantage of using your graphics in a remote or an arbitration exercise is you get feedback right away on the concepts that you've developed. So this is helpful before you go into the actual arbitration to be able to see what works or what needs tweaking and be able to do that before you actually use it with your panel. Now, this is a clip from a mock arbitration exercise we ran a couple of years ago. And here a retired judge explains how overwhelmed he was by the technology at issue. Oh.
The technicality of it. I feel somewhat like a high school kid who's had a little algebra being asked to take a differential calculus test.
So explaining the technology is very important. And we'll do that shortly. But first, what I'd like to do is share some examples of what we call before and after graphics. So it's what we've received from the client and then what we've created. So you can see our thought process in doing so. So we know that timelines are an excellent way to present a sequence of events. Here, however, as we worked with a trial team, we learned that where Sam Johnson lived was more important than the timing of the moves. So instead of a timeline, we placed the events on a map, adding them in chronological order. And this format more effectively showed where in the world Sam Johnson's family lived, both at the time of his seizure and afterwards. Dealing with large volumes of data can be very difficult. In this antitrust matter, the trial team assembled this huge Excel spreadsheet with all the communications it could find between competitors as they were sharing information. And of course, this was in violation of the DOJ guidelines. So we started thinking of this giant Excel spreadsheet as a nefarious web of communications. And so we did indeed create this web of communications. So each of the red arrows indicates one communication between two competitors. And this really brought the spreadsheet to life. So how can you make your demonstratives more effective? We think there are four things to focus on as you're developing your demonstratives. First, tell a clear story, summarize the evidence, teach the technology, and create a path to a favorable outcome. So help persuade. Let's look at story first. So of course, a timeline is an excellent way to tell a story, especially in an opening, to get what this case is about and what the dispute really revolves around. As you'll see here from these text entries, Conclave was the respondent in this arbitration. And we were working for the claimant. And you'll see that throughout the time of the contract, Conclave never quite met its performance goals. So we show the timeline data below the time bar here, each of the entries. And then we have other data, the production rates and more up above, so you can actually see how Conclave performed. And here you'll see these outlines show absolutely no deliveries at all during this time. So one thing to keep in mind as you're developing timelines, and some of you may do this already, but because when we do this, we tend to build the timeline on a series of mouse clicks. Each entry appears by itself. So for instance, you could take the September 25, 2011 entry, add that to show the issue of a very long delay. and then go to interior slides, which would show maybe excerpts from documents or a video deposition clip from a witness or other types of data, then come back to the timeline. So it's a richer way of telling the story as you move through your opening. Okay, next point, summarizing the evidence. So timelines can take many forms, and in this business interruption claim, we needed to show the impact of a hurricane on a shipbuilder's construction schedule. And although this may seem busy, it demonstrates that all ship sets were impacted by this hurricane. And this was really useful as a summary, because one thing to keep in mind is that you want the arbitrators to be able to review the demonstratives on their own afterwards. So when you're designing these, you want to make sure that they can stand alone, that what the point of the demonstrative is present as they're looking at either a printout or reviewing a slide deck again. Okay, again with summarizing information. This was a dispute between two private equity firms. And one issue was whether the respondent, Summit Funds, improperly hired employees from Castle Rock. So we first focused on the pertinent provisions in the contract, and note the 12-month limitation. And then we created a timeline that showed each of the new hires, when they were terminated by Castle Rock and when they were hired by Summit Funds. And in pulling it all together, it shows that in fact, all of the new hires, the key new hires, were outside the 12-month limitation. Okay, teach the technology. So as we saw from our first video clip, this can be difficult for some arbitrators, even if they might be a mechanical engineer. Just understanding the specific technology for the case at issue is very important to be able to describe accurately and clearly. In this particular matter, this shows a train tunnel that was flooded again during the hurricane. And we begin with a blueprint image of the tunnel. And these red arrows are pointing to these concrete barriers around the edges of the tunnel. And these barriers contained all of the electrical components and the other infrastructure elements that are so important to running a tunnel. And unfortunately, with this flat blueprint, what this did not convey was the fact that the barriers continued along the edges of the tunnel for the entire way. So when they were damaged, there was a significant amount of damage. So what we were able to do was give some perspective here. We built this out as an illustration. We added the track and we added the shelf-like images showing the electrical components. And then added the floodwater up to the level that was known, and you'll see the yellow highlighting indicates damage. Okay. Another technology point. The technology at issue here was how a GPS system works, and they're very complicated. So what we needed to do was explain to the arbitrators how each portion of the overall system worked on an individual basis. So anyone who had used a GPS would understand the simple explanation first, and then we would move to the more fine detail that described the algorithm. So here we needed to explain time tag error. So what is that? When a car drives along a road and the orbiting satellite passes by, the satellite's absolute time is slightly off from the clock on the cars, the GPS clock in the car. And you'll see it's just a few hundredths of a second, but it can cause a lot of problems. And if you've ever used your GPS to point you in the right direction and the GPS says, turn right on Elm Street, but you realize Elm Street was 2 streets back, that's what time tag error is. So we needed to make this clear for jurors, for the arbitrators in a very simple way. And then, of course, for them to be able to go back and remember, well, what was time tag error again? We have the text on the side describing what the definition is and how it can be used. Okay. Finally, create a path to a favorable outcome. So this is one of my favorite demonstratives. And in this construction case, we needed to convince the arbitrators that the claimant's own actions caused its financial failure. So in closing, we summarized all the poor choices the claimant had made and did it by literally digging a hole to show that, in fact, RFM's problems were all of its own creation. So, do not be afraid to use illustrative demonstratives with arbitrators. They're actually if they're well done, they're certainly accepted well. So I have 2 final points today. First, what makes a visual presentation effective? Be sure that what you tell the arbitrators is comprehensible, whether it's the technology or the sequence of events. And again, if you can plan it so that when they are able to go back and look at it and review at a later time, it still is clear to understand. If you're going to use a graphic, make sure it delivers information. Look at your graphics critically to ensure they really do contain the message that you want the arbitrators to retain. And finally, try to use visuals that will be memorable to the decision makers. I'd like to end this segment with another clip from a mock arbitration. And here are his thoughts on using visuals.
And I'm very big on treating an arbitrator or a judge as a jury.
Okay.
Very important. Do not assume the arbitrator gets it.
Explain
Say
that,
it,
teach it,
show it.
show it.
Okay, thank you for your attention. And I'm now going to turn this over to Joe Simons, who heads up our trial tech group.
I think you're muted, Joe.
Thank you, Dinah. Can we see this okay?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, like Jerry Reese said, I have a long way to go and a short time to get there. So I apologize for talking a little bit fast, but I got a lot of things to go through, and I've been told that my schedule is ambitious, so I will be talking a little faster than normal. But if you know me, I'm going to tell a story about my dad, who is 98 years old and still practices and actually does mediations and arbitrations. And about a decade ago, I gave him a tour of our facility where I was working at the time with all the technology bells and whistles. We had a scanning area, we had a database area where we built databases for trial presentation. We had a video area where we processed video evidence and synchronized video depositions, made video clips of depositions, and a graphics area where we designed graphics for trial presentation. And he looked around and kind of shrugged and said, in my day, all I needed was a flip chart and 4 color markers, and I could make any point that I needed to. And in his day, that is all he needed. But in today's world, even jurors my age and older have grown up with visual learning and MTV, and they expect electronic evidence, and they expect to see things in a visual method. So how do we show it? With trial technology. So you find out what sort of platform you're using, or you have to choose your platform. Usually nowadays, it's chosen for you, and it's a good thing because there are a lot of options out there. But typically, you're probably going to be choosing between two. One of these I know you all recognize because we are holding this meeting via Zoom, and it is a popular choice. And the other one, if you don't recognize the logo, is for WebEx. And early on, say a year ago or a little more, I think a lot of people selected WebEx because there was a difference between WebEx was more secure, whereas Zoom was just easier to use, and choices would be made on that basis. But I think the gap is narrowed, and of course Zoom is more secure, and WebEx is a little more user friendly. So the choice isn't quite as simple as it was, but I see a lot more things going via Zoom as it's just easier for most participants. Either one will work just fine. There are some things to consider. The rules of engagement, which were addressed earlier. It's usually pre-decided by the arbitrator. I know AAA will send out a list of criteria, but things like who should be on screen and when. Typically with a one-person arbitrator, you'll have the arbitrator, the witness, the questioning attorney, and opposing counsel. You'll have those people on the screen, and that will leave you plenty of room for a view. You can have those 4 or 6 if there's a tribunal on one side, and then have room to present your visual evidence on the other. I'm not sure how you're looking at it today. There's a couple ways to skin the cat. You can have it all on one screen where you have people on one side and then the visual evidence on the other, and you can kind of move a slider to have it bigger on one side, and however you please. Also, it might be a good idea to look at a 2-screen setup, which we'll talk about in a minute. But another consideration is exhibit introduction and marking. Something that you have to think about in advance. A lot of people still require paper documents and things like this. You can send out a whole set of exhibits in paper form, or you can send out exhibit binders on a regular basis. Typically, for an electronic type presentation, you can have an online Dropbox where all the exhibits are uploaded, or some other sort of download site. And that way, when you can have all the exhibits available electronically if you need them. If you have an additional exhibit to mark, which you will, you can upload it there so that everybody can access it. And also, most presentation platforms have a way to share documents as well. I know with Zoom right now, you can drop a document or PDF into the chat feature, and it's immediately shared with all the people that can access chat. So there's lots of ways to go about it. You can email, lots of different options, but things that you need to think about beforehand. Virtual sequestration of witnesses. Generally, it follows the same kind of rules as if you were in person. Is that witness allowed to be with counsel during breaks? Are they on cross and they can't be with counsel? You think about this beforehand, and you set up your breakout rooms, which we'll talk about in a minute, so that it follows those rules, which brings me to separation of parties. The breaks in the breakout rooms, you set up one for each party, and you have an additional breakout room ready in case you need to put your witness there or any other parties that need to be separated. And it also pays to have somebody who's running your meeting, a host that can set these things up beforehand and make them go a lot more smoothly. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. Last but not least on this particular slide is the virtual backgrounds, the ups and downs. We've all seen the horror stories. We've all seen some of the terrible virtual backgrounds out there. Some of them are lovely. I think we can all agree that for the most part, they can be distracting. Whether they're pretty and you want to look at that, or when somebody moves, you can see things going on. They are also dependent on system resources. I've seen them fail. I particularly recommend for presenting attorneys to have a physical background behind them. Something, and again, I'll talk about that a little bit more, but something that might show the party company or the firm name, so it's easier early on in the proceeding for the arbitrator or arbitrators to see which party is speaking at which time. And nowadays, arbitrators won't allow witnesses to have virtual backgrounds. They want to make sure that nobody else is in the room. And they may even ask a witness to turn the camera around so they can see if there is anyone else in the room. That's my little piece on virtual backgrounds. And a couple of other considerations: where are your participants located? Do they need to be in the same place for any particular reason? Do you have to have a physical location? Can this be in the offices that you use currently? Do you need to lease out a meeting room for this? And if you do that, do you have the correct equipment? Do you have the right computers to use? Do you have an equipment? Do you have a connection issue? Do you have a fast enough connection? I'll talk more about that in just a moment. And who needs equipment? Not everybody has a system that can do that can act as a proper witness system or as a presentation system that's strong enough. Some people can just use an iPad, and in many cases that's fine. But you also need to consider the experience level of the person that's using it. Are they tech savvy? Do they need help? Do they need training? These kind of things. So that all aside, and you're ready to move forward, you got to decide on who's going to host your matter. Can you do it yourself? Maybe you have a tech savvy person in the office that can run a Zoom session. It's pretty easy. How many people do you need? Well, one person can host it fairly easily, but you have evidence that needs to be presented. You would need a person to present that evidence as well. Can it be the same person? I've done all three, and I say all three because I have hosted and presented evidence for both sides. But very few matters are that simple to do that. You got to have very few exhibits, and there really can't be any consultation between parties if you have one person for ethical reasons. So I would always recommend that you have one person host who takes it off of your shoulders. Hopefully that person is a professional, can handle things as they go awry, and can make sure that people are on time from breaks, set up breakout room. And then one person to present evidence for each side. That way, you can confide in that particular person and let them know your strategy, and they can recommend the best ways to go about showing it. You can have that person available to you after hours. We'll talk more about that in a moment as well. So it pays to have a professional host. So you've made these decisions, and now you're working on the setup. So you create a plan to connect teams based on their needs and the location for the arbitration. The picture that you're looking at now is actually very, very similar to an arbitration that I handled at the outset of the COVID shutdown. And it is very close. I say very close because it evolved as we went along. And the presenter on the far right of the screen, you can't really see, but we had set them up with a riser so that it felt like a podium, and they needed their entire team to be in one room. We were in one state, opposing counsel was on the other side of the United States, and the arbitrator was in yet another state. And that's how we handled it. And this is only one part of the setup. We had additional rooms in that firm for other participants. The client had their own observation room with no camera so that they were private. The attorneys that were working on upcoming witnesses had another observation room. And then we had two smaller rooms set up with computer set up so that you could prepare witnesses and they would know how it would feel to use the platform for their testimony. So in order to do things like this, it's helpful to have a professional to make a plan, to work with the firm's IT department to make sure you have a proper connection, you have the proper equipment. You can look at floor plans and make recommendations depending on the kind of rooms that you have. Provide equipment setup recommendations for the best viewing, and this can be customized to the different parties that are participating, whether it be attorneys, clients, additional attorneys, or witnesses. They can provide guidance in lighting, background, webcam, microphones, all these little details that become extremely important when you're hosting an online proceeding. And then they can obviously appear and arrange and manage the equipment setup, which is very important at first, but it's even more important as you go along because sometimes things fail. I know this comes as a surprise. Technology does fail, and it's always nice to have somebody there to pick up the pieces and let you know, oh, this is going to take a minute, let's take a break, or let me get this right back up for you, and they can help change equipment as your needs change during the proceeding. And in this case, we also had an Elmo set up next to the presenter as well that was connected via the session. So if you did have a stray document, you can display it, although we never used it just for those records. Proper naming. I had actually set up an additional keyboard in this instance so I could change the name of the presenter as they swapped, as if it was a courtroom setting. And I also added a little tag as to which party they were from so that it was even more easily identified. And I already talked about the virtual backdrop, which I don't recommend. The physical backdrop is what we had sitting behind the presenter where you see that table. So show it, displaying your evidence and some of these considerations. I talked about the advantages to using a presentation tech. And obviously there's advantages to having one for both sides that I've talked about. They can show exhibits in real time. They can show depositions, video testimony, or for impeachment. If you have somebody that can't show up and you have a video deposition, they can help you create those clips and show it in place of testimony or for impeachment if the arbitrator will allow that. And they can coordinate with your graphic designers, all the wonderful people that Stuart and Diana work with. The presenter can make sure that they have the most recent presentation and even make last minute changes if need be. And then there's tools of the trade, and inside Peak, I'll give you a quick show of a presentation software, and a decent tech will be able to switch back and forth between PowerPoints just like I just did. Bring up documents on command, show them side by side. They can, obviously that text is kind of small. They can do call outs. They can do highlighting for a little better impact, and all other kinds of annotations. And like I said, they can show video testimony. I don't have the sound turned on because I'm talking. I didn't want to be distracting, and I didn't want to have to stop the Zoom session, but I'm showing it with the scrolling text. A lot of people feel that gives you more impact. It's also really helpful if somebody has a thick accent or if the audio is hard to hear, and you can read along at the same time. So back to where we were. So that's a quick intro to Peak. The software package that I just showed you was called OnCue, and that's one of the more popular ones. It's an up and coming. And there's another one called Trial Director, which if you've heard of trial presentation software, that's probably the one that you've heard of. It's been around for a very long time. Typically, a trial tech will choose whatever tool is better. They each have their ups and downs. Feel free to email me if you want more detail on it, because I could talk for another hour about that stuff. So a tech can give you a seamless presentation, show immediate on-the-fly access to exhibits. It's not linear. You can choose any exhibit. You can pick any page. They can show it on demand. Display a lot of electronic evidence natively. So let's say you have a case that's heavily based on spreadsheets. When you have a tech, you can bring up that spreadsheet and show it, and show the inner workings. You can show the different tabs, how it works. Maybe you have schedule files. You can show it in the native format, and that's a huge advantage. Streamlines proceedings. Arbitrators may require it. Arbitrators do require it. It helps things move along faster. It helps keep things organized. So most arbitrators absolutely do. All right. So some of the advantages: consult on how to best present your case in the chosen form. And there's a little snippet of how it would look with a two-screen setup. You have your parties on one side, leaving you an entire screen for your presentation. This is even better when you have a tribunal, because you can fit more people on one screen. It also allows you to place the camera over the party screen, so it looks like you're talking to the parties, and then have the evidence off to one side, very much like a courtroom setup. And we call this Brady Bunch mode, where everybody is kind of stacked in boxes. A tech can advise on the best way to clearly show exhibits and the participants, like I just showed and I just discussed. Consult on platform functionality and transfer of exhibits. Present tech work with the team through every minute to ensure a seamless experience. And when it's all over, a tech can help you with remote witness prep. So witnesses that are in other parts of the world can prep and see what it's going to look like when it's real, and also facilitate your war room meetings, because most of the time everybody is not in the same place. What could possibly go wrong? Famous last words, right? There is pitfalls to connectivity, platform security and stability. It's better now, but it's not perfect. And my favorite, have a backup plan. I think the Navy SEALs say 2 is 1 and 1 is none. So try to have 2 of everything. If you try to be hardwired with a cable instead of wireless, have wireless as a backup. Have a hotspot just in case it all fails. So always be ready to adapt. It's nice if you have somebody there telling you, we need to take a break, or I can have this back up in a couple of minutes, fill the time. but be ready to adapt, and this is where it pays to have a professional. What does it all mean? I'm going to land this plane very quickly, almost done. You choose your platform. You decide how you're going to work within that platform. You plan your physical layout and equipment. You enlist experienced professionals if you need it. Use a trial tech, we help, and have a backup plan whenever possible. Thank you so very much for your time. I truly appreciate it. If you have any questions, we would really love to hear them. You can reach us at these email addresses. And once again, thank you so much on behalf of everybody on the Decision Quest and US Legal Support team. Ann, I see you're back, so I am going to pass it back over to you.
Thank you, and it was an excellent presentation. I want to thank Joe, Diana, Stu, and Stuart, excuse me, and of course Brian. Brian, did you have any final comments you wanted to make?
No, not at all. Just thanks to everyone for joining us today. I hope you found the presentation informative, interesting, and any questions at all, please feel free to reach out.
Okay, and just as a note on the ADR practice section, we have several upcoming presentations on hard to get CLEs. One of them is going to be on professionalism in mediation, and I believe that is in July. And then we have Henry Paul coming back for one of his very popular ethics in mediation presentation in the fall. So thanks to everyone from US Legal Support. It was an excellent presentation, and we appreciate you taking the time to put together such a very helpful presentation. So at this point, I think I'm going to terminate our presentation. We are close to the end, and Lauren, you can turn off the recording at your leisure. Thank you very much.